I'm here wearing my trashy and sassy shirt and having finished the last week of GarbAugust, in which I read Go Ask Alice. This week was WTF week, and there is nothing more WTF than the story behind this book and the question of whether this is one of the biggest cons in book history. And Go Ask Alice is this book that is supposed to be, it says it's by Anonymous, but it's supposed to be about this 15-year-old girl who, in the span of a year, gets hooked on all sorts of drugs in every different way, goes to a mental institution at some point because she gets spiked chocolate-covered peanuts at one point in time, and just absolute insanity. This book just goes from 0 to 100, back to 0 in a year's time. And we have to keep in mind this was a 15-year-old girl. Now, when this book came out, it came out in 71, I believe, which is why some of this sounds very dated in the kind of like, hey, groovy, we're in the hippie type, whatever, sort of thing. When this book came out, it was marketed as a book that was true. It was marketed as a book that, this was a girl's diary that had been found, and the whole thing was very much marketed because drugs were the big spooky thing in the early 70s, late 60s, that everybody was supposed to read this as a true sort of indictment of the drug culture in the United States, in teenagers, and how rampant it was, and it was just absolutely rife with everything. Now, I'm not sure how this book fooled people as long as it did, except that as a teenager reading this, I would think, yes, this is very salacious. This is all sorts of material about all kinds of drugs and sex and wild parties and all this sort of stuff. I, as a teenager, maybe wouldn't have questioned it. I do remember this book when I was a teenager as, that's the book that, that was the kind of gritty book that teenagers weren't necessarily allowed to read. I believe it was banned quite a bit, too, which, based on the content, I can understand. But as an adult reading this book, I don't understand how anyone who's ever spoken to a teenager thought this was actually from a teenager. Because I'll get to the story behind this book. Because this book, as you read it, first off, the speaking voice does not sound like a teenager. I know it's dated, but the person who's writing does not sound like a teenager. And the second thing is when you start questioning the story, the timelines of all of this is clearly nobody has ever, who ever read this book, had ever talked to a drug addict or a teenager. Because this girl is like shooting speed before she even gets on pot. I mean, the reaction to pot is just like somebody who'd watched Reefer Madness back in the day. It was just like crazy, weird behavior. I work in a high school. I see kids involved in drugs a lot, and this is not the behavior that you get when that's going on. You recognize certain things, but they certainly weren't what was going on in here. This timeline is in a year, and this is a 15-year-old we're talking about here, that we go from just drugs are just free-flowing. It's just like a smorgasbord of drugs. Everyone's handing out drugs. LSD is everywhere. You're just throwing it to the wind. You can just stumble in a house and just fall into some heroin. It's wild times in this book. It is wild times. From she tries to get off drugs, and then her friends are all like trying to stick joints in her purse and trying to lure her back to the parties, and until they spike her peanuts. And just this whole wild, it is so over the top. It is so over the top that you can just be like, this isn't true. This is absolutely not true. The time frame is incredibly off. The first part of the time frame I question is when she says she loses 10 pounds in a month, and I'm like, oh honey, that's not healthy. And then she gains 15 pounds in a month. That's not even part of the drug part. We've got that going on. And then in a year's time, we've gone on a roller coaster of a lifetime of crazy, wild, salacious behavior, all because of the demon drug. And it seems like, and of course, and again, you'll understand why when I tell the backstory of this book, of course, it seems like she's actually got her life back on track. It seems like it's at the end, and then there's an epilogue boom out of nowhere. Oh yeah, 3 weeks later she died. 3 weeks later she OD'd. Even though there's no evidence that's going to happen at any point. It just like, it seems to be like, well, we have to like morally kill off this person because, you know, she was doing bad things. And this is one of the most unlikable main characters I have dealt with. She is whiny and obnoxious and dumb, and just, she does this, and this is a writing thing. She does this thing where she repeats the same word over and over, which is very annoying. It's like, that was fun. The party was wild, which I've never seen anyone writing in a diary do. It's just it's insane writing. And the more it gets into like the drug-fueled fog, it just seems like somebody's crazy fever dream of what they think drugs are. So let me get into the backstory of this book. This book was actually written by a Mormon housewife. Her name was Beatrice Sparks. She said she had a PhD from UCLA. Now, there's recently been a book written called Unmask Alice, which was about this whole phenomenon and everything that happened by Rick Emerson, I think. I'll put it down in the bottom. But he went into, never could find her credentials about anything. Well, she wanted to be desperately a published author. She couldn't get published in what she was trying to peddle, and eventually she peddled this. They decided to market it under an anonymous thing because she said this was diaries she had found, and she had just like cleaned up a little bit and blah blah blah. Well, in his research, let me look at the name because that's going to bug me that I don't remember his name completely. Emerson, Rick Emerson. In Emerson's reading, and in his, when he started to research, he said there were no diaries. There was never any evidence she found anything. There was some evidence she did talk to a teenager who had been on drugs, but seemed like the teenager made up a lot of the stories, like they were a compulsive liar and just embellished and made up stuff. And she took the stories she'd heard and kind of crazy. Remember, this is the era of satanic panic is on the horizon. This is the era of a lot of like panic-fueled things. So she took a lot of that, made this book, marketed it, and for everybody who was feeding into the panic and thinking that pot was being sold to 9-year-olds, actually LSD is being sold to 9-year-olds in this book, because apparently the 3rd grade and 4th grade were just rife with this too, according to this book. So feeding into all of this, she wanted her name on it somewhere eventually and wanted credit for it. They never really did. They still don't in it, which is, again, a marketing ploy I don't agree with because this is not accurate. It was written by a middle-aged woman, not a teenage girl. They proceed to market this, and that lie maybe could have passed. It's just a very sketchy marketing way of doing things and way that she got her book out there. The thing that became unforgivable was the next thing she did. A woman whose son had unfortunately committed suicide. His name was Alden, and he had actually left diaries, and his mother contacted Beatrice Sparks. She was also a Mormon, and she thought that there was some connection there, and maybe there could be another book being written that would maybe address the issues. This young man seemed to have a lot of depression issues, and he had a kind of love interest thing that was not working out. So anyhow, she sent all this to Sparks and thought that this could have been used as something. Sparks did not contact her back, went and published a book that she called Jay's Journal, where she didn't even change some of the names of stuff, so it was very easy in the neighborhood to figure out that this was who this was about, was this young man. And she proceeded to get him heavily involved in Satanism, because that was the craze at the time, was the Satanic Panic. So she makes up these whole stories about all this stuff, very salacious, that he was involved in, that were never part of anything. She just blatantly made things up, and then other parts of it were just actual diaries where she did not change much of anything in there. So it really was unsavory. The family didn't even know this was going to happen until they saw the book out. And the whole situation on that is just so unethical in that they had to eventually move his headstone into storage, because it became a local like hangout for the kids who wanted to like a satanic spooky place to come hang out and do things at. It just was all in very poor taste. This woman never apologized for any of that. Continued to go on writing books where she tried to get her name more associated with them and more attached to them. They were always marketable enough that she could get another one, but they were never as marketable as Go Ask Alice. But the whole unethical nature of how she wrote and what was involved in her writing is just so tawdry and so unforgivable in a lot of ways that I have some strong feelings about this author, and certainly about this book as you're looking at it. This book is poorly written. It's clearly not true, and is just, looking at it from a critical eye as an adult, all over the place. It is not a single bit of this. You're like, there's no way any of this could be true, other than somebody just making as crazy of a story as they could up with this. So yes, this would be a very appropriate book for WTF on GarbAugust the last week. It is something. It is a book. It is a book that has a lot of notoriety around it, even now to this day, just because of the way that it was put out and the way that it was marketed, and probably deserves the infamy that it has sort of earned. And this one is definitely not going on the shelves in the high school library. This one is going straight to the thrift store, because there is nothing accurate or to me even valuable in it at all for actually doing anything with drug prevention in any way, just other than using it as a scare tactic in some way, shape, or form. But anyway, that is the last week of GarbAugust, and it ended on quite the story here.